So here we go. This deals with the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. And the question is, what is the appropriate policy response? And before continuing, let me just say this. On a number of things that I've presented on, for example, tax reform, I've felt that the analytic material sort of strongly suggests a certain response. But in this area, what's the appropriate response to the Black Lives Matter protest demands? I certainly have a very different view, which is it's very controversial, hard to sort of formulate specific appropriate policy responses. And so I very much, look forward to the discussion later and other people's feedback on this. Okay, so with that, I'll talk just briefly about my campaign. My campaign theme is bold structural change, not just incremental reform. And the reason I am pursuing this sort of campaign strategy is we face 5 crises, and it's important to reflect on this. We have a public health crisis, the pandemic. We have an economic recession. Both of these disproportionately impact lower income and minority communities, so that creates a bit of a social crisis. We have a pending $8 billion budget crisis in Olympia because tax revenues to Olympia are going to decrease due to the pandemic and the recession, and expenses on things like unemployment benefits are going to increase. So we have a huge budget crisis in Olympia that's coming up. We have the racial justice crisis, which we'll talk about today, and we have climate change. And as a function of this, it's very uncommon in US history to have 5 crises occurring concurrently. And it's for that reason that my campaign's about structural change, not just incremental reforms. So we need to avoid austerity in the upcoming budget balancing in Olympia. We need a new source of progressive revenue. We have the most regressive tax system in the whole country. So we tax our poor more than our rich, which is shameful. We have a climate change crisis that needs to be addressed, and we need to address the challenge of racial justice. So these are the priorities of my campaign. Again, the crises demand sort of structural change, not just incremental reforms. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about the Black Lives Matter challenge, and then we're going to talk about reform possibilities, and I've divided them into 2 categories. One set are tactical, and one set I'll call structural. And as you can tell by what I just said before, my inclination is to focus more here than here, and I feel like a lot of the dialogue is occurring here. So I'll talk about those themes later, and then I'll just summarize with a discussion of themes, and then we'll have a discussion. So the Black Lives Matter challenge. Probably many of you, myself included, have participated in the protests. This is one in South Seattle. The magnitude of these has been quite shocking. It's almost inconceivable to have 40 to 50,000, 60,000 people protesting in Seattle. It's been very sort of compelling in my opinion. The crisis, of course, we're all familiar with, so I'll just be brief. We've had this string of highly visible shootings of unarmed African Americans by white police officers, but Trayvon Martin was one of the first in recent times that were highly visible. Michael Brown, Manuel Ellis, that's in Tacoma, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and as we all know, for every one of these that we see through video cameras and etc., there's who knows how many that are occurring that we don't see. So this is an ongoing, recurring, very troubling phenomena. Of course, it reflects, all sorts of background areas of underlying discriminatory practices in our society. Healthcare access is differential according to race. The pandemic is disproportionately impacting African American communities. Restarting the economy, we're going to be sending, we're sending workers back, and they tend to be disproportionately minority workers, etc. Climate change. So we all know this, but the point is these, the shooting incidents are one issue. There's these underlying structural discriminatory issues that I think are huge. So you'll see as my talk progresses that I feel like, yes, there needs to be change in this realm, but there also needs to be change in this underlying realm. lest these changes will just end up being cosmetic and not overly consequential. So that will be a theme. Also in our society, you know, it has to be said, politicians from both parties exploit people's fear of racial violence. Even Bill Clinton, you know, emphasizing three strikes. We had the Willie Horton episode. You know, it's part of Donald Trump's campaign, of course, to inflame racial tensions. And these phenomena go on, but, you know, and we all know this, but we have a broad-based crisis that's manifesting itself in the realm of the high-profile police shootings. By virtue of talking about scope for today, no, actually, this isn't scope. This just deals with the nation's history. So this is just an extension of the last slide. I'm not going to try to make any effort to provide a history lesson, but I did just sort of lay out key events in the history of racial tension in our country. And it is to make an important point. So, you know, after the Civil War, obviously, there are now black codes are instituted. The Reconstruction process is butchered, and racist structures continue on. Later, Plessy versus Ferguson is passed, which says that as long as facilities are quote unquote equal, they can be separate, and that's not changed until the Brown versus Board of Education. We now live in an era where Michelle Alexander and others refer to as the new Jim Crow era, the age of mass incarceration. And the point of all this is that our society reproduces systems of racial injustice. So once one system ends, let's say the slavery era, oppression just gets reproduced through other laws, other structures, other institutions, and it's an ongoing problem. And so the question, of course, becomes, how does one start to dismantle this societal pattern of reproducing racial injustice, okay? So my next slide deals with the scope for today. Obviously, there are many, many issues that need to be dealt with concurrently to have a meaningful discussion on this. And these are a list of issues that I'm not going to cover today, not because I don't want to, not because they're not critical. I do want to, and they are critical, but rather just due to time, I'm not going to be able to. But that doesn't mean in the discussion later that if people want to bring these things up, that would be great. But I'm not going to talk about the contradiction inherent to the founding of the United States. On the one hand, we claim all men are created equal. On the other hand, the country has slavery. You know, all sorts of demographic groups can't vote. So there's a contradiction that recurs throughout American history. I'm not going to talk about white privilege, patriarchy, reparations, statues and monuments and parks. That's a huge issue. I'm not going to get into that today, although it would be fascinating to get into that. Curriculum, corporate responsibility, brands like Aunt Jemima, Colin Kaepernick and others who I strongly support, but I realize that's a controversial view. Protests, the potential invocation by Trump of the Insurrection Act. There's technological issues of racial profiling through artificial intelligence and cameras. There's interesting policing models in other countries. This brings into question issues like decriminalization of drugs and sex work, gun control. There's also important linkages between the Black Lives Matter movement and the LGBTQ community, and as well as Black and indigenous peoples of color. So, and also there's the other perspective, which is, what does all this do to police recruiting and hiring and retention and morale and effectiveness? So to have a meaningful discussion on this obviously would probably take a year, and we have 30 minutes, so I am gonna, as I said, not address these explicitly so that we can focus on one manageable issue, but I'm not unaware of the importance of these and other issues. And certainly, as I said, please feel free to invoke these or whatever other issues you want to later in the discussion. Okay, so we have a major challenge with a strong historical legacy, a very painful legacy, and we're going to be focused on sort of one dimension of that, narrow down the scope, and that is, what should the conceptual approach be to addressing these issues? And I've developed a schematic diagram This is my own. And so I've laid out sort of 5 camps from my following and reading about the issue. So what are those camps? Conceptual approaches. The first is we don't change things. We stay with sort of a law and order model. Okay, so what do people think about that? We focus on cracking down on the protesters. This certainly isn't my preference, but it's important to come to terms with because a lot of people do fall within this this option. Second, there are calls for defunding the police, and yes, some of these are literal calls, not just figurative. Some say let's cut police budgets by 50%. Some highly informed, intelligent, activists say it should even be further than that. So we need to come to terms with it. I don't share that view, at least of cuts of that magnitude, but they certainly need to be taken seriously. And maybe many of you do, and I look forward to your comments on that. Where I sort of focus are on these 2 areas, reimagining and restructuring police. So change some policies, roles, practices, and also extend this to the criminal justice system. So there's a reform, restructuring endeavor that I believe is appropriate here, not so much literal defunding. And then the second area of focus of my candidacy is addressing these underlying inequalities. In my opinion, if all that happens from these protests are some police policy changes, this won't be nearly as consequential as it should be, and the real power is going to be in dealing with this. And then there's the 5th camp, which is to change the whole system of capitalism. And the theory is capitalism requires cheap labor, and it's convenient to have that cheap labor be minority groups, especially when they've been persecuted historically. So the whole system needs to change. And I'm not going to cover that today because that's well beyond the scope of a state representative to deal with, even if they did believe in that. And second, even though I think there are many problems with capitalism, I'm not aware of a superior model. So I'm not going to deal with this. I just include it for the sake of comprehensiveness. But anyway, there will be a lot of different views on this, which is great. And let's talk about these now. So I'm going to go through them one by one, starting with law and order. Not going to go into detail. I just think it's important for us to be aware of the the support behind this. So Donald Trump, they demand law and order. They may not say it, and they may not, let's see here, there we go, not be talking about it, but that's what they want. Some of them don't even know that that's what they want, but that's what they want. That's from Donald Trump. The next one is the president tweeted that if protesters breached the White House's fence, they would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs and most ominous weapons I've ever seen. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm only bringing it up to make the point that in advocating for change, it's important to acknowledge and recognize that there's going to be a lot of opposition to that. A lot of people sort of share this view. Option 2, defund the police. All right. And so I'm going to show one slide of arguments in favor. This isn't comprehensive, it's just sort of representative. And then a slide on, people arguing against this. And it's important to understand that some people actually are arguing for abolishing the police. So here's Miriam Kaba. Her article in the New York Times is called, "Yes, we mean literally abolish the police." All right, this is 2 weeks ago. Enough. We can't reform the police. The only way to diminish police violence is to reduce contact between police and the public. There's not a single era in U.S. history in which the police were not a force of violence against Black people. I've been advocating for the abolition of the police for years, regardless of your view on police power, whether you want to get rid of the police or simply to make them less violent. Here's an immediate demand we can all make. Cut the number of police in half and cut their budget in half. Fewer police officers equals fewer opportunities for them to brutalize and kill people. This idea is gaining traction in a number of cities. Okay, there's an intelligent, informed activist, and there's a considerable number of people that share and are advocating for this view. Next, sort of a different rendition of the same theme, former Dallas police chief, he said this a few years ago, and his point is that we're asking police officers to do too much. All societal failures are be putting into the camp of police officers to address. You know, there's not enough mental health funding, etc. School problems, we let police officers deal with that. So the whole area has become too big, with the implication being that it does need to be significantly reduced. So sort of different perspectives, but that support the same conclusion. How about the opposite conclusion? Well, there's a lot of people arguing against this, of course. Numerous analysts are making the obvious point that this could have negative impacts for public safety, defunding the police. Other people have made the interesting point that it may, in fact, if this were pursued, hurt the very communities it's intended to help, in the sense that if police is massively defunded, affluent communities are in many cases going to be able to hire their own neighborhood you know, services to protect them, protective services, so, and low-income areas won't. So it could lead to further, you know, bifurcation of crime rates. And then we have a couple quotes from the Santa Clara Valley Signal a couple weeks ago. The suggestion of defunding police around the country is the single most absurd idea we have heard. Proposals vary. Some call for shifting, some call for elimination. Yes, there's bad cops, but majority are good, decent people doing a difficult job. So they're calling this idea absurd. And there's a researcher at George Washington University, Stephen Crawford, states that when the Baltimore police stepped back after the uproar over Freddie Gray, crime rose and the homicide rate became the highest in the nation, and he claims it's naive to think that abolishing the police will reduce a variety of crimes. You know, arguments for, arguments in favor. As I've suggested, I don't favor, you know, some massive defunding of police, but I'm aware it's a very controversial topic. What I favor are restructuring reforms, and this is just a sample. You know, in my reading, I've come across, you know, hundreds of different potential reforms. So this is just a sampling of them. I'm not going to go through them in detail or exhaustively. Some involve demilitarization, make sure that military technology isn't transferred from the Pentagon to the local police departments, ban flashbang devices, blast balls, rubber bullets, wooden bullets, remove police officers from schools. The one I think is perhaps the most powerful is unbundling police services. So in some cases, it may be appropriate to set up mental health specialists who can respond to certain crises, social workers that can respond to others, rather than have the police be called so ubiquitously. Some people are advocating for two lines, a 9/11 line for police response, and then a mental health social work response. So this would lead to a downsizing of police departments because they'd be handling less things. Police procedures, ban chokeholds, eliminate no-name warrants, display badge numbers, etc. Restrict the use of force, more training, more oversight from community groups, weaken unions. Another columnist for the New York Times, Ross Duthot, says it's too hard to fire bad cops, too easy to rehire them, too difficult to sue them, etc. So there can be reforms there. New policing models, community policing, having officers reflect the demographics of their communities they serve, investment in social programs, etc. So these slides will be posted on my website. The important thing is to realize that there are hundreds of them. I certainly don't pretend to be an expert on these, but I am intrigued and believe there is a lot of possibility to institute, some reasonable number of these, and that would lead to a downsizing of the police departments, which I think is appropriate. And a streamline and a refocusing and a reimagining. So I do think there's a lot of power here. All right, and in addition, there's reforms that can be made to the criminal justice system, sentencing reforms to make sure that, some of these have been done already, but making sure powder cocaine and crack cocaine are penalized the same, rather than having crack cocaine, which is more disproportionately used by minority communities, be penalized at a higher rate. We're familiar with many of these things. Eliminating bail, which is racially biased against lower income people. There's opportunities to create diversion courts so that, for example, for low-level drug offenses, a person can go to a drug court, not receive a sentence, but instead have some remedial things they can do, but still enable them to be with their families. Ban private prisons, focus on all sorts of rehabilitation programs, re-entry programs. Ban the box, which has been instituted in Washington State, calls for ex-felons to not have to check a box on their job applications that indicates that they're an ex-felon. Restoring felony voting rights, that hasn't happened. But in any case, again, there's lots of opportunity for reform in the criminal justice system. So I do advocate for police reforms and for criminal justice system reforms. And there have been a lot of things that have happened in Seattle. Carmen Best, black police chief in Seattle, she was left off Mayor Durkin's short list several years ago to become the chief of police, but that led to an uproar. She was hired. Initiative 940 changed the standard for acceptable use of force by police officers. It used to be in Washington State that you had to demonstrate that a police officer acted with malice if he killed somebody in order to find him guilty, which is absurd because how can you ever prove that? So that was overturned, and now the statute says something to the effect that if a police officer had to have acted in a way consistent with how a reasonable officer would have acted in those circumstances. There's a consent.
John, it's 11:25.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. There's a consent decree between the Seattle Police and the federal government. Recently, the Seattle Police Officers Guild was expelled from the Martin Luther King Labor Council, which argued that its policies were not consistent with the Labor Council's policy. There have been local community commissions established. Police officers have been removed from public schools just a couple weeks ago. We're having budget debates about how significant the police budget reduction should be. Black Lives Matter has called for 50%. Mayor Durkin only instituted a 5% reduction, so there's ongoing discussions there. There's, of course, issues of what should happen with the Capitol Hill occupied protest zone. There's an article in today's paper on this, which is interesting, and a federal judge has banned the use of pepper spray, tear gas, etc., on protesters in Seattle. So there's things happening. Surely it's just the sort of the start of reforms. It'll be interesting to see how things play out. Next, just comment on what I consider an important view, which is that really, although yes, police reforms are important, yes, criminal justice reforms are important, structural reforms are where it's at. So this is a columnist, Charles Blow, is written on a variety of civil rights issues. And I'm going to sort of skim read through this, but these reform bills, if they pass, would basically punish the system's soldiers without altering the system itself. And I agree with this. And then he goes on to cite Martin Luther King. What he was seeking, what we were seeking is quality education, jobs, housing. Those things will actually cost the nation something, and that's where real justice looks like. Equal access to possibility, success, and safety. We must set our sets high. There's no glory at aiming small and seeking breadcrumbs. But no one wants to talk about it because to truly tackle these issues would deal in some way with wealth redistribution, and the very mention of that throws the rich into a tizzy. So, and here's my concern, which he's articulated. We'll ban some chokeholds. We'll collect some new records and disclose others. We'll put constraints on officers requiring more training and exposing them to litigation. But remember, these are not necessarily rogue officers. These are instruments of the system and manifestations of society. These are instruments of the system and manifestations of society. They are violent to Black people because America is violent to Black people. They oppress because America oppresses. And I think this level of reform has to be dealt with. I've put some data behind this. I find all of these shocking, and I think we should be shocked. I worked in the Seattle public school system as a substitute teacher for 15 years before teaching now at Mercer Island High School. And if you look at the percentage of African Americans on free and reduced lunch in Seattle schools, it's 83%. And for Caucasians, 8%. And as I said, that's just absolutely startling. And it's the South End schools, all of which I've worked in, where lower income minority students are concentrated. When I worked as a substitute teacher, they had a hard time filling the substitute positions in the South Seattle schools. All the substitutes wanted to go to the higher income northern schools, so we had high vacancy rates in the South and no vacancies in the North. But we should be shocked by this. And we should be concerned, and of course what I'm suggesting is until these things are addressed, we're going to continue to be frustrated by more cosmetic reforms. These differences, of course, lead to huge differences in test proficiency. So this is black versus white 8th grade math and reading scores for, in Seattle schools. With white students on both math and reading performing at more than double the rate of black students. This, of course, then leads to income differentials, which, of course, has huge impacts for crime rates. So this is just an extension of Charles Blow's, commentary that until we're willing to deal with these things, which does require some level of wealth and investment redistribution, in my view, we're just going to continue to be frustrated by reforms. And I hope that these protests lead to change here, and that's what I'm advocating for. So how do we address societal injustices? Healthcare has to be universal. I favor a single-payer healthcare system. The minimum wage, which is good in Seattle, but there needs to be ongoing increases, universal daycare, etc. And then I have a proposal that I'm running on, amongst other things, in my candidacy. I'm calling it community investment schools. So we deal with schools, for example, in Seattle on a two-tier basis. There's the standard investment schools, and then there's community investment schools. And a community investment school would be triggered by statistical thresholds like, let's just say 50% of the students or more on free and reduced lunch. And once a student qualifies that, it would receive increased investment, which would be paid for by decreased investment in other schools. So let's say Aki Karosi in the South Seattle becomes a community investment school. Teachers and principals would earn a 20% pay premium to work there, or some such. Class sizes would be lower. There'd be more wraparound services, counselors, healthcare, and there would be the introduction of advanced placement and/or international baccalaureate programs, which has been done successfully at Rainier Beach High School. And the corollary to that is, let's just say Eckstein Middle School in the North would receive less funding. This of course would be controversial. I understand that, but it would make clear that enormous socioeconomic differences are, if society allows them to exist, are going to be addressed by policy, and there's going to be financial consequences to that. So I advocate for this, and as I say, I think it's important to address changes at this level of society. So I advocate for changes, as I've said. I'm now summarizing: reimagining and restructuring police, reimagining, restructuring the criminal justice system, and also, in my opinion, even more important, addressing underlying societal inequalities. And my last slide, themes from today. I think this is a huge moment, and I think we should interpret it that way. The Black Lives Matter protests are legitimate and meaningful, and they bring into question huge issues about the nation's history and its future. The protests and the demands represent a long-term challenge to be embraced, not just a short-term problem to be solved. And so I hope that these protests lead to structural change. And so, as I said, I think we should restructure the police and the criminal justice system, but also make sure we're addressing through specific policies underlying structural inequalities. And again, that's consistent with my campaign theme of structural change, not just incremental reform.